This event is part of the 2021 Critical Poetics International Summer School. The Critical Poetics Research Group is based at Nottingham Trent University and provides a platform for exploring the role of creative and critical writing in promoting cross-cultural conversation and driving social change. My name's Zayneb Allak, and I'm a writer and lecturer in creative writing. I was also the first research associate on the Critical Poetics project when we set it up in 2017. So I'm delighted to be able to host this event and to see how far the project has come. This year, the Critical Poetics Summer School investigates the theme of care in all its contexts. How has the global pandemic changed care? What does care now mean in light of the social injustices and inequalities foregrounded by Black Lives Matter? What does it mean to be charged with the care of animal, vegetal, and mineral life forms during the sixth mass extinction and the care of the environment in the ongoing climate crisis? Furthermore, how has care, both as a concept and an experience, changed for writers, artists, critics, and readers? Organised by the Critical Poetics Research Group at Nottingham Trent University in partnership with Nottingham Contemporary, Curated and Created at NTU and Metronome, the 2021 Summer School consists of public events, workshops, performances and readings designed to interrogate the degree to which writing, art, criticism, or a combination of these can help us attend to manifold, interconnected and collective care responsibilities. This evening, we're delighted to hear from poets Nat Raha, Bhanu Kapil and Raymond Antrobus for this special event on troubling care. Each poet will read for about 15 minutes, after which we'll return with Nat and Raymond for a discussion of their work. It's now my great pleasure to introduce tonight's readers. Nat Raha is a poet and activist scholar based in Edinburgh. She's the author of 3 collections and numerous pamphlets of poetry, including Of Sirens, Body and Fault Lines, published by Boiler House Press in 2018, Counter Sonnets, published by Contraband Books from 2013, Octet, via Books 2010, and Four Dreams, published by the Earthbound Poetry Series in 2020. Her creative and critical writing has appeared in South Atlantic Quarterly, Third Text, Poetry Review, Map Magazine, the New Feminist Literary Studies, and in the 2020 anthology On Care. Her writing has been translated into French, Galician, German, Greek, Polish, Portuguese, Spanish, and Slovenian. Nat co-edits Radical Transfeminism zine. Raymond Antrobus was born in London to an English mother and Jamaican father. He's the author of The Perseverance, To Sweeten Bitter, and the children's picture book Can Bears Ski, illustrated by Polly Dunbar. In 2019, he was a recipient of the Ted Hughes Award and won the Sunday Times University of Warwick Young Writer of the Year Award, and became the first poet to be awarded the Rathbone Folio Prize. His next poetry collection, All the Names Given, is published in September by Picador and Tin House. Winner of the T.S. Eliot Prize in 2020, Bhanu Kapil is the author of 6 full-length collections, and most recently, How to Wash a Heart, published by Pavilion Poetry, and Incubation, A Space for Monsters, published by Kelsey Street Press, forthcoming in a new edition with essays on performance and shame, and a preface by Unsung Kim. So, over now to our readers.
Hi everyone, thanks for tuning in. I'm going to start by reading a short poem that I was working on at the start of the pandemic, just kind of thinking through some things, and I think I read it in one of the very first kind of online readings that were happening at that time. Prevail joy in the face of this. Noise cut. Dissolving ground dehydrated, where we lay feelings cope. Tearing from future days, depth circular and draw, nerves arterial out to tongues bloom, simmers, join and means deploy, striped triangular. Vulnerability steps. Remember the means we came to be. rest flesh in multitude, spines on text and paper. Passion isolate, the ease with which we freeze, crowned to cower and eyes sprint, deject, energetics. Ruination flies its in the data graphs about us, icing ankles. Nest on the need sensation skin to shimmer. They leave you with so little methods left to speak and part. Circulate means base, curb tendrils, the amplitude depatterned. Refract the speed in which you are. Ingenerate light. Bear what and how we lose each other. Unstitch the scope of where you're fixed. I'm gonna read two things for the rest of the reading. I'm gonna start by reading this long poem that came out in Map magazine back in March. It's called Blubber, Guts, Southern Leaf. It's on the history of industrial whaling in the 20th century, and in particular Edinburgh's connections to it, particularly in the neighbourhood of Leith, which is a port that kind of got subsumed into Edinburgh around this period as well, which is where I'm currently stood. My block is the block where all of the business based here was situated. Well, I shouldn't say housed, where they had their headquarters. So the poem has a description of the hunt of a whale and the skinning of a whale, which is in section 5. So it's not the most pleasant reading. But I will pleasant listening. But I will number the sections so you know where it's coming if you want to mute. Blubber, Guts, Southern Leaf, 1 and 2. Icebreaker. Hold still. A touch. Shred the opportune from possibility, life from its reflexes, of the fear and upheaval known. Lived, passed through, speared, incarcerated, disrupted. Ecological ruin, sown in, land, grabs and steam. Cast violent lines out from Europe, the reordering of sea, land, life, ground bitten and frost, horse, permeated, the Atlantic in wakes and flows, directions to ferment colony with durable hands, ships forged on these northern shores. Lay the ropes of the world in your desire to control, profit on hunt, bid lines warfaring, raw material to sake market, all cetaceans game, in the simplicity happening to be there here. Mind's eye fed resolution and adventure, to stumble, survey your wilderness of water, ice to seek wealth and oil, heat and food, knowing your insatiable islands, every last seam as possible industry to carve dominance. Three. Ultramarine. Driven polarities to align, compelled from vertigo. Light cut in scope of your buoyancy, forged in thousands, wet eclipse, refrain submerged, rich on the volume of body. Blue and humpback to black depth, motions blessed to krill. And on the memory of vast kin, the century each of you might span, air in the thrive. And for water to be known as South Atlantic, Antarctic perimeter, heartland to impose human roving and harpoons, trades, noise marked by royal standards for the industrial frontiers of Europe, in pursuit of new flesh, having dredged the lives from your nearest waters. Turned other for salve, sun, to drive extinction, for shadow temperate edges dulled, the permanent day worked on as ecology touched only into itself, prefabricate an industrial harbour, corrugate iron and asbestos, and minimize later a pelagic factory to float without regulation. Thor. Repeating, resonant flash, cool, inchoate, hydrophonia, low, hertz, frequency, blues, stereotyped, two lulls, migration, lows, waves, crepuscular babble in miles of hundreds, and carries, submerge, Atlan, Isity, know and tune ears with age. Repeating, resonant and flash, the noise we tune into you, cool, inchoate, mechanical frequencies, churned carbon low, and life possess frequency, blues, nuclear and sonar, stereotyped, and diesel and other missiles. Migration, blown amplitude as modern waves, cut edges and crepuscular babble in miles of hundreds, and carries, submerge, trade noise and ice cuts known as commodity and Atlan, frequencies to vibrate, oceans heat, no channel, tune ears, direct the melt. Five. Low price works the Antarctic density. Heart bowled over water. Coiling, fires and hoists to flag the dead. A courier body. Steam, blue spots, fin and wrong. Sinks rapidly. Barrel on ties, trajectory. I fill ahead. Spring-loaded innovative line. Even the catcher would recoil by the gun. Shoots in the footage. Cries when you axe its life. Becoming unit, becoming catch. Tugged and hauled to the flensing plan or bow. Peels back skin and blubber would leave the rest of you out to float. Later, cutters worked out guts, warmed his hands on your blood, took the rest to the steam saw. In the Fordist heat, extracted, stored your oils, boiled down, coagulated, churned to hard fat, taken to market, to face hunger, bodies, mouths, burners, stoves, guns, accounts. 6. Laying out the scope. Named after the port that housed its parent company between 1909 and 1963, Southern Leith housed the largest fishery to have ever existed in the world. Run by Salvesons on the island of South Georgia, it was 2 oceans from the continent where its produce, alongside with the wealth that came from extracting so much life from the ocean, was destined. By 1914, 4,500 humpback whales hunted, producing 8,000 tons of oil a year. 1925, 8,000 whales, blue, fin, humpback, southern right killed in a year for £300,000 of profit, which is about 100 million today. Whale oil produced from blubber was used in cooking, in margarine, and later in nitroglycerine for explosives, primarily for European markets. 1931, 42,000 whales killed in a year by pelagic whaling. Over the 1930s, Salvesons made 1.1 million from whaling, which is about 365 million today. Taxes on the industry funded UK research into whale biology to provide a basis for industrial sustainability in a context where its workforce understood to be unstable. In over 50 years, this industry pulled 1.6 million cetaceans, including 300,000 blue whales and 700,000 fin whales from southern oceans. And current blue whale population estimates are around 25,000 worldwide. These numbers describe the mass slaughter of and extraction of wealth towards Scotland and the UK from the world's largest mammals. It is one link among many that begins with a land grab by the British Crown and ends in near ecocide, to bottle and barrel the dwellers of the bottom of the oceans. While creating work for urban and industrial communities, urban and island communities in Scotland, its colossal extractions of wealth primarily benefited the capitalist class. 7. Given today, how water as animate turbulence cuts southern exposed shores, mountains, worlds where drinking water dries, historically marked by colonial extractions. And that today, these Atlantics swim with memory, living also in human workers, industrial pillage, its afterlife moving as accumulated capital. And that in the desire of nations to control oceans, pour frequencies and detonations to service the next war, disrupt planetary needs we need to trust, rush dives up to beach whales, the stress of military occupation. In reply to decades, silence, neutrality, reluctance to turn wealth into a means to heal, to cede control, what reparative relation could be forged from here to oceanic life? Melodies absorbed by water, I lay it sounds, weave by your calls morning. May the war games freeze by the ice they wash from earth. May empires rust. Okay, so the second half of my reading, I'm going to read 2 sets from this ongoing sequence called Apparitions, or 9 by 9. It's a sequence of niners, which is this form coined by the poet Mendoza and adopted by a bunch of other contemporary poets, which is primarily a 9-line poem with nine syllables in each line. We've been talking a little bit about how it's kind of a perverse form. It's about with constrainment and constraint, things kind of emerge. And been working on it for about 4 years. I started writing it at the end of 2017 when an activist collective I was a part of were being violently attacked by the right-wing press in Britain, and it's kind of, I think it's kind of developed quite a lot since then, and also like it's kind of like trying to absorb some of the grief of Sean Bonney's death in 2019. Abandoned on love, we queers, left to our own. She, Els decades saw nostalgia out, diminished, vibrate into and out of tour. Bare unequal dist, thresh, held, skin in likeness, you, memories split and wired, dejected, weight phrase and delve out of what prescription, vacuum split, polyphonic, alternative from these needs, resolute, our alien mew. Zik reversing monocult, its clocks group us now, an easy fiction, emergent, dizzying, dusk shards hanging on us, animate lives of the present. These decades-old violence for bored, stars and black salt, she said the possible diminished, order administered names, heart and solstice-eyed, fall into the wage day, turbulent shimmer, out of discourse traded close, pinned, ordinary trappings and verse, to squat, dislocate. Decima unmade and horny, our shaven flesh and locks dined on black beans, corn and sugar, vagabonds, tinkers, tricksters and jailbirds had demanded our bodies owe fascist rags, codes and divisions, systematic flesh and capitals. Nostalgia imposed and derivative nations, soil. This poem's written after a song by the artist Kindness. In softness as weapon, casting logic's callous from us. Arms as air, as sea, sensations spun. Unbind as refusal, slow expanse of day's sequence. Retuned, keep near your pastel tones, depth sights at heart on keys you grant yourself. Femme vox affections unfurl. Sheer of these days all fact will be thrown scald nebula between the livid and liminal, compress, sculpt and sketch your tendons. What gives analgesics to these? In writhing accumulate, popular asset and fictions, and making the scope of labels, lines wayward sought on no keys. So how about that flaming global order? Conjugation of our revolting looks, mouths and passions, your horror that we could bloom, scripting lashes in digital, from your genes impure, be light, collectivize a means to body, urgency scored to futures, revoking your vocabulary. And girl, who are you to abandon the beautiful, jettison ways of being, pursed on edge, on song, speed, surface, divine, tuned, luxurious, the earliest known sensations adorn, woven silk, learning your rhythm from canvas, lubrication for your flesh. Of all taken from bodies, our remaining hunger, and with it your price tags on sustenance, delay pay rents, imaginary chains of power, purchase, what we call to abolish. Shh. We've reassembled our affections and solidarities, our cracked, effervescent hands. We, the invisible, streets strewn with feathers, our solitude, negative reveries vibrant, squatting schools and rulings, your nights ripped by fire, disinvest ed, the deep in particular of flashes our memory embodied, itching, wet on the Union Jack, your truths will be rerouted. Sure, with your meager hoarded fragment of earth, gold, store your germs and spoils defended from the right to roam, the decayed and undead. We declare centuries buckled in such violent, torn and shredded viral logic, its impossible defense. Hands shatter the perimeter. More dependent cages unwritten. Stretched verbs revised, bonded, victors, capital, etc. Fly no flags as evaporate currency, stone, know this hand. Your devious logics, neo-occupation of words, sentiment, bare grammar of bodies, tangential, trained, maneuvered. They that would revoke this flesh, in fear of fictions breathe what is given the flow, structured to materialize with love and capital in life. That your image speaks so sparse, coarse and hollow cognitions, overdetermined, exchange value, brand, appropriate. As all the exits shut, reverse the town hall, each riot van, engine removed, chassis, neo-marine, ecology, sensate, vessels, history, bitter, buried sands, ride it up the walk, seam before tarmac, babe hold, frequencies to be removed from the air. On the stand, list your horrors, proclamations and divestments, pour blood from the crown and ideo, your archaic printed mergers, blood and severe lies to this day. Against the name of your inflictions, your rubble and basic hatred. Turn hands to gather, stolen lives and back bodies. Schema divesting black and brown breath, burn up, anded nest, synthetic pale on prey, screech bitter salvation prized. Light disdain, cool, benevolent, neolib tears on our cellular, carbon-based, carbon-torn stones and plaster time contained to fail, continues its ordinary. Systemic denigrate breath, chart, cold golden sick on quotidian, contiguous memories of your violence embedded, smoke screened, accumulation on crisis horror, iridescent throne, earthen cuts, to claim, to clear, flow flag blood, pure decay, remove how the earth is walked. All riches, all fruits, all cotton that was worked, the narrow administration, your cash flow, worlds Please, years, force his, they deem not work. Stories under deprivation, downward bracket closed, rip the crux of our instruments, rot bodies, driving urgent project, protest, lunar logic between callous from us. We, the invisible, flow, flag, blood, pure decay. Pour blood from the crown and idea called the benevolent of words, systematic flash and capital, the waged day, turbulent shimmer. Sensate vessels, history, bear unequal dist, thresh, divine, tuned, luxurious. They deem not work, vaulting looks, stories, mouths and passion, coarse and hollow cognition. Thanks.
All right, hello. I'm going to begin. I'm going to read some poems between two books, The Perseverance and All the Names Given. And I think I'm going to begin with where the beginning of The Perseverance, first book, opens with this idea of who gets to access higher ideas, who gets to access the divine. And it's an idea which came out of visiting Gaudi's cathedral in Barcelona just after my dad passed away. And I was doing the audio guide there. And there's a particular part of the cathedral in which it invites you to look up and sing underneath this small unorthodox shaped roof, and be vigilant of how the sound moves in this area, because it's believed that the way you experience sound in that particular space is a kind of how angels, an experience of how angels live through sound and experience sound. And I was having that experience through hearing aids, through Bluetooth and all this technology which connects me to the hearing world. And I was wondering, are deaf people, are hard of hearing people included in this idea of elevation of sound? So I'm just going to read the first section from that. Echo. My ear amps whistle as if singing to echo, goddess of noise, the raveled knot of tongues, of blaring birds, consonant crumbs, of dull doorbells, sounds swamped in my misty hearing aid tubes. Gaudi believed in holy sound and built a cathedral to contain it, pulling hearing men from their knees as though deafness is a kind of atheism. Who would turn down God? Even though I have not heard the golden decibel of angels, I have been living in a noiseless palace where the doorbell is pulsating light, and I am able to answer. So I'm going to read now from a new book, All the Names Given. This is one of the first readings I'm giving from this book, so it'd be interesting to see how it feels how it feels to have these words in the world, how these poems feel in the body. So I'm just going to share the screen. This is a poem called Plantation Plaint, and it engages, thinking of this idea of care, it engages with a poem by Lorna Goodison called Different Shades of Black, and a painting I saw in New Orleans called Plantation Burial. And it was a sheer coincidence to be standing in the historic New Orleans collection opposite a potential ancestor of mine who'd been a painter and painted this, what was called a slave burial. So Black people who were enslaved and worked in the plantations were given their time to bury their dead. And this painting captures that. And my wife, Tabitha, who's an art conservator, whose job is literally caring for painting and anything made of paper, I've learned so much just watching the kind of care she has to have in her work. So there's so many different kind of conversations around art happening in this conversation, as well as representation. So Plantation Paint, after Lorna Goodison and Plantation Burial in the historic New Orleans collection, 1860, oil on canvas by John Antrobus. Tabitha, the art conservator, squints at the color, tells me the paint depicting the black of these men huddled for a burial will decay before the cypress trees surrounding them will decay. There are several kinds of black, she says, and the cypress trees surrounding them is all I see as we stand alive in this otherwise empty gallery. Why am I like this? What am I like? Who does it matter to? All details question my way of seeing. All details question my way of seeing. I worry what kind of black would mark me. I am not the paint made from vine twigs or burnt shells. I am not the lamp full of oil. Tabitha, tell me how you paint me. Tell me if I'm closer to the white painter with my name than I am to the black preacher, his hands wide to the sky, the mahogany rot of heaven. Sorry, but you know by now that I can't mention trees without every shade of my family appearing and disappearing. I'm going to read a poem which came out of, in my first book, I had a poem called Two Guns in the Sky for Daniel Harris. And having a poem like that out in the world led to a few people actually writing to me who not only resonated with the story of what happened to Daniel Harris, a deaf man who was killed by the police. It turned out that this was a common thing of someone with a disability, not just deaf people, a kind of miscommunication between someone's need and a misinformed or untrained armed police officer dealing with, in effect, people, members of the public with disabilities. So I'm just going to read this poem. I was living in Oklahoma for a lot of the pandemic, and this story came up about an Indigenous man called John T. Williams and something that happened to him. And this poem looks at, it uses captions, and it's a kind of dreamscape poem as well. And the way in which it, I suppose, speaks of care is this idea of care with information, be it information from the media and information of someone's life, and trying to weave them into the space of a poem. So captions and a dream for John T. Williams of the Nuchanu tribe. Sound of unstable air. He fell facing away from the police officer, 4 bullet holes of the left side of his body, hands holding a block of cedar wood and a 3-inch blade he used to carve canoes and faces into totem poles, announcing it is not over. The police officer said, I yelled at him to drop the knife. Sound of something left out. It took 5 seconds to shoot. John T. Williams' brother sat on the pavement. He didn't turn away from the block of cedar wood that still shone on the road. Careful speech. The reporters pushed microphones into his face. My brother was deaf. Sound of no season. He spoke each word for the trembling broadcast as if his brother could still read his lips. Sound stolen. They took something beautiful from us. Wailing. I dream of the crosswalk at Borden Avenue and Howell Street. In my dream, John T. Williams appears in a whaling canoe. When he paddles, the water doesn't ripple. I ask if he has a favorite sound. The lake melts, becomes a narrow street. A kettle boils silently on the pavement. John T. Williams points at a house. There are still keys hanging in the green door. I follow him into the living room. He is setting the table for a meal. I ask nothing. He pours tea. There is tapping at the window. Someone is humming in the garden by a totem pole, summoning the sound of hands, leaving a mark. Thinking about, I suppose, the care that we can take for ourselves as writers, I find that when I'm in the mode of writing a book of poems, I straight away check myself into therapy to make sure that I'm not relying on the poems or the practice of poetry to kind of resolve any of my own traumas or histories. So I have a space outside of poetry to help me, I suppose, take care of myself. So I'm going to read a poem which I wrote specifically using the questions that came up in therapy for poems. So this poem is called "I Ran Away from Home to See How Long It Would Take My Mother to Notice." And it's just all the questions that came up in a particular therapy session, just throwing them in one place. Are you my drunk teacher who took our game of rounders way too seriously? Are you the boy who said I had the ugliest smile on the playground? Are you the girl who toe-punted my balls and made me a piss sack of blood? The girlfriend who slept with women behind my back said it wasn't cheating? I don't know what I'm saying. Would you be my friend? I spent hours in the house alone as a child. I left fingerprints on my sister's CDs as the music kept skipping. So the music kept skipping. I wanted her friends to be my friends, but I wasn't invited to her parties. Are you the party? Are you my dad lying on the sofa saying I'll soon be dead? When I pull what is existentialism off my mother's shelf, Simone de Beauvoir says, the movement of my transcendence appears futile. I don't know what that means, so I put it back. Fuck, who loves me? I'm testing everyone. I need space for all my old and new gooey needs and projections. I need constant blaring validation alarms. Give me award ceremonies. Please observe my wall of fame. Best second-guessing overachiever. Best internal monologue while drying dishes. Best self-promoter at the charity fundraiser. Best awkward silence in a moving vehicle. Best bad advice to a couple in crisis. Best non-smoker in the smoking area. Most self-centered fear during the global pandemic. Lifetime Achievement Award for most convincing head nods in a crowded pub. Most triggered person in an empty house. Okay, so I'm going to read a poem which at first I was very nervous about because I wanted it to be a poem which takes care of the person in which I'm writing about. I think Hannah Lowe has a poem in which she says, you've got to be careful with what you do to people in poems, to known people, real people. And I bumped into a friend of mine just before the pandemic hit, and we hadn't been in contact at all since we left school, and it was quite a blast from the past to kind of see him again. And it was obvious that like he hadn't left Hackney. He was still very much kind of in part of the ends, part of this area which we grew up. And I've kind of lived all over the place. I've lived in different states in America. I've lived in South Africa. I've lived in parts of Europe. And so it was interesting seeing him again and having this brief interaction. One of the things it brought back to me is this idea that poetry is essentially music from the place in which we are born. And so just hearing him speak and being around him brought back some of the music of the landscape of where we were born. And I hope that this poem shows, honors that and cares for that. So this poem is called "And That." After seeing a childhood friend outside a chicken shop in Dorset. Chicken wings and that. Boss man, salting them and that. Don't assault man, give man a napkin. Big man, no steroid in that. Dark times, new street lights and that. House man, I'm getting by and that. Still, boy, them harassed. Not beefing, not tag man, still trapped. Cycle man, peddling and that. On road, new pavements leveled and that. Crackney change still stay dwelling and that. paradise moves, but I got to land grab. We ate, East man ain't got to adapt. Our kingdom got no land to hand back. Man chat breeze, chat trade winds and that. You out ends got good job, legit and that. Locked off man, then stay plotting and that. Raw Ray, flower shorts, you hipster in that. Man gone vegan, no chicken wings and that. Yeah, okay, I'm gonna have 2 more poems. This book opens with a sequence thinking about the care and thinking about my time in education and how much the story of a nation is something which everyone is indoctrinated with. Whatever country you're born in, you're indoctrinated with a story of your nation, and you grow up to have some pride in the kind of official story of your nation. And it's you know, when you start traveling, it's so interesting to go to, and I'm sure a lot of British people with parents and family and heritage of people who from countries who are essentially colonial subjects. You know, you go anywhere in the Caribbean, you see all the names of all of these other places, originally from England, being transported, you know, to these islands and to these colonies, present colonies and former colonies of the British Empire, and how we aren't taught that, and how there's you're hit with a real kind of almost a nausea when you travel and you have to make sense of this, I suppose we could call it this miseducation of our country, and no matter where I go in the world, it seems that everyone has some kind of unlearning to do in terms of themselves and their country. And this poem tries to do that, I suppose, because my name Antrobus takes root in this place in England, in Cheshire, and I went there and wrote this poem. I went there with my mom and wrote this poem. Wherever you are, this is called Antrobus, or Land of Angels. Wherever you are, you touch the bark of trees, different yet familiar, says Lord Milos. I can be fiendish, I can't be English, say ghosts, some with shaved heads, some with cane robes, muttering themselves into notebooks. The barman's eyes and the Antrobus arms become sharp gates when I claim to be English. My mother born here, my grandfather a local preacher. Oh, well then, welcome, he says, or land your angels. There are enigmas in my deafness. I stare at the crest of gold lines behind the bar. I scar the cross of Davidic's line behind the bar. Hear my ghosts say fiendish, English. The barman calls the whole village and my name does the rounds. My mother drives us to Antrobus Hall. 2 German shepherds surround the car. I climb out. It's raining, but dogs jump, their paws scraping a new coat of earth on my chest. A farmer appears, asks if we're descended from Edmund Antrobus, Sir Edmund Antrobus, 3rd Baronet, slaver, beloved father, overseer, owner of plantations in Jamaica, British Guyana, and St. Kitts. I shake my head, avoid the farmer's eye. My mother and I tread the cemetery of St. Mark's Antrobus and see everyone here is buried, and see everyone buried here is of Antrobus. We look up and see hawks in the ash trees and sparrows in the wheat fields and the rain-soaked stones of Antrobus. And after we walk the slick mirrors of wet roads to curves of Barber's Lane between trees, I take a photo of our shadows flung over the red berry bushes like black coats. And the last poem I'm going to read is for a friend of mine. I went to 2 schools. I went to a deaf school and I went to a hearing school. And this is for a friend of mine who passed away recently, a couple of years ago. And his story stayed with me. I never thought it would be something I would be given the opportunity to write about. but I did, and I'd just like to honor him. Thinking about care, what care is, who is entitled to care, and the injustices that go when we think about why wasn't this person cared for. In a way, there's a constant conversation to be had between, what I would call human rights abuses, and disability rights and the right to live. So this is my last poem I'm going to read. Thank you so much for listening and giving me the space to be heard. For Tyrone Givens. The paper said, putting him in jail without his hearing aids was like putting him in a hole in the ground. There were no hymns for deaf boys, but who can tell we're deaf without speaking to us? Tyrone's name was misspelled in the HMP Pentonville prison system. Once I was handcuffed, shoved into a police van. I didn't hear the officer say why. I was saved by my friend's mother, who threw herself in the road and refused to let the van drag away. Who could have saved Tyrone? James Baldwin attempted suicide after each of his loves jumped from bridges or overdosed. He killed his characters, made them kill themselves. Rufus, Richard, Black men who couldn't live like this. Tyrone, I won writing awards, bought new hearing aids and heard my name through the walls. I bought a signed Baldwin book. The man who sold it to me didn't know you, me, or Baldwin. I feel I rescued it. I feel failed. Tyrone, the last time I saw you alive, I dropped my pen on the staircase, didn't hear it fall, but you saw and ran down to get it, handed it to me before disappearing, said, you might need this.
Okay, so first of all, thank you so much. Thank you so much, Nat and Raymond, for your readings. And Bhanu, obviously she's not here. So to kick off the conversation now about care and poetry, I wanted to just first start with my response to your readings, which was, I was surprised because I teach poetry and read poetry, and I thought I would be, I didn't think I would necessarily have this reaction, but I listened to you and thought, oh, I really needed that. I needed to hear them, and I really felt you making contact. And I really noticed the care that they were written with and the care in the readings. And wanted to ask you about, well, Bhanu in her reading said, I hope this reading reaches you. And it was it felt like care. It felt like she was really caring for the poetry and for her listeners or for her readers. And I thought maybe we could start off the conversation by thinking about what you hope for your poems. Do you care, and how do you care about how they reach people and what happens as a result of it? Maybe, I don't know, maybe start with Raymond because you're not on mute.
Yeah, I think that's such a generous response. Thank you, Zayneb. I mean, obviously we have no control over what our poems do in the world once we've written them and they're given to you, to the public, to the wider world, and whatever happens there is just a blessing. I believe, I agree with what Bhanu said about this hope that they reach people. And I really do write with the belief that, there's a real danger that everyone is in if we fail to care, if we fail to understand each other as a society. So my hope is that the poems I write, or even the lessons I teach, or the talks I give, all of them are, just connect, land, spark new conversations, inspire, uplift, criticize, all of we're quite ambitious with our poems when I think about all of the hopes we have. But ultimately, it comes with the craft, it comes with the practice. Poetry is a care for language at the most kind of at first internal level, and then how you kind of bring it out into something external, to something shared. And then this other idea, like when you were reading out Nat's biography, and you were talking about how many languages they've had their poems translated into. And every time I hear that, I can't lie, I get a slight poet jealousy, because I'm like, oh man, your poems are reaching so many people in so many languages, in so many cultures, at so many different points of time. And the two languages I ground my poetics in are British Sign Language and written language and spoken language. And I do classify each of those three things as different languages with different feels, with different textures, with different ways of being. So, there's a real, as well as care, there's a real kind of act of faith becoming a poet. You really have to believe in what you're doing, and you really have to, and I think so much of my teaching when I speak with other poets, so much of it is about telling other poets that their work matters, that they're writing important poetry, and that people need to hear what they have to say. And if we're careful with our poems, they will matter, they will sing.
Oh, thanks, Raymond. It's really interesting because you as in Raymond, you mentioned about how your partner is a curator, I'm presuming, and a preserver of art. That we right? Yeah. And I guess in that idea of concept of curator, of being a curator in the art world, is like that you care for the works, and obviously there's a whole thing about how artworks are often cared more for, receive more care than the people who make them, especially when we're talking about Black and brown and disabled and other marginalized folks, right? But I think for me, there is a similar thing in the writing that so it's about beyond maybe after the act of having written a poem, and obviously sometimes that's really contextual, sometimes really writing a poem for a particular context, a particular occasion, a particular moment, and the context of those moments in terms of who is in them, what is happening, be that a political moment, be that a response to a political moment. I guess I'm often thinking very directly about who I'm kind of writing this poem for. And maybe there's something similar for me when I'm thinking about how they're going into the world. So as somebody who's published a lot of my work myself, and also, working through a lot of small press and small press spaces, it sometimes does feel a bit more specific. So I for all of the work that ended up in Of Sirens, Body and Fault Lines, except for the end of the book, I put most of it out myself as zines, and it became these were just objects I was carrying with me when I was traveling. Went to do some readings. I was in the States for a while, I did some readings there, just handing them out to people. And the people who I often met in those moments have since become some of my closest friends, and some of them are also poets who are also publishing and editing and translating work. And so that becomes actually, and they're the kind of moments of publication, or the moments of the poems getting out into the world that that really almost matter the most for me, because they're the ones where it's we're actually in some kind of loving friendship, caring relation between me and the person who's tending the work, putting it out into the world. And that's what really matters. And when with the translations, that's a lot of it has been like that. Sometimes it's just somebody who I know from the internet who's hey, can I translate your poem? Sometimes there are people I've known for years, and sometimes there are people who I just met because we have a shared political interest, or we're talking about politics of care, or we're talking about queer politics or something, and that's brought us together. So that does still feel like that tends. And maybe so beyond publication, I guess, is also the performance. And thinking about that context of both what it means for me to perform in different spaces, and where do I feel that I'm putting out work in a way that's the kind of forms of holding and tending and like support and I guess even just like hoping other people might feel heard in some of the words or in some of the phrases. Those moments of connection with an audience or with a listener or a reader are going to come in more specific places than, say, more dispersed general ones, you know. So I'm writing all these poems that have like, you know, it's like, girl, it's like I'm talking to like the femmes out there, right? The people I care about, who are maybe already outside of, or either marginalized or like denigrated in these in the dominant normative economies of care, because care is always this economy and it's always about reassuring patriarchy in some way. And yeah, and so that's why I mean, I could talk for hours about how it changes from the different contexts that you're reading in. That, you know, sometimes you do a reading and you're like, oh my, I don't even feel cared for in this space, yet alone my poems, you know. There are other times where I'm reading and I feel like I'm just at like, it's like the community is here and this is our work and this is where my work makes the most sense, even if it's like different aesthetically or something. I don't know. Yeah. Oh, you're on mute, Zayneb.
So maybe it'd be interesting to think about the limits of care, and particularly in relation to poetry. So, for example, I know, Nat, that you've written about, like, you write and research about the limits of care. That's part of your research, and the idea that a poem, you know, it can be like a hug, but it's not like a roof over your head, or it's not like a hot meal on your table. It's not that kind of practical care. But then when I was listening to your poems, and I was listening to Raymond's and Bhanu's, all of them, I was thinking, and thinking about Raymond speaking about Gaudi's cathedral, I was thinking, these poems are spaces filled with light, filled with sound. Like, these are all little cathedrals that I can enter, and they do give me a kind of roof over my head, but there's a limit to the care that they can offer. I don't know if either of you want to comment on that. Maybe Nat first.
Yeah, I think it's, and obviously with Barney's reading, it's Barney's just like really been presenting us the work in this, like, when the poem is up against the conditions of caring in order to exist. That's something I can really relate to without having to go into my personal story about it. But it's maybe it's like a roof over the heart or a roof in your head, right? Because in all of these moments of deprivation, like, we still need art, we still need poetry, like, you know, it's like the bread and roses thing, right? It's like, it's no point just having the bread, because it like affects you physically, psychosomatically. You know, if you don't have that enrichment and nourishment in you, yeah. So I definitely think about that, and that's like, and I think on the one hand, from like trying to write poems from these moments of care, and also trying to be like, it's not always easy. Care isn't neutral, you know. It's a real like, I hear conversations in terms of the research side of the things I'm doing at the moment, where people are we're talking about the appropriation of the discourse of care, or the complete like reduction of it to total banality. You know, it's like when Nicola Sturgeon comes on TV, I live in Scotland, when Nicola Sturgeon comes on TV and says, oh, everybody in Scotland's going to be cared for during the pandemic. That's something she said last spring. And we're like, mate, we're on the streets handing out masks to people who don't have any money. Like, you're not doing anything in that sense. Like, sure, she's doing stuff, you know. But it's that thing of like, that's the kind of appropriation of this language of care, because that's appropriating this kind of political context that me and the people around me who are doing this kind of mutual aid and support work, that we're also like, it's a politics of care, it's an economy of care. It doesn't mean anything without those contexts. And yeah, and so how does like, it's funny, because then it's like, oh, loads of carers are also people who write poems or make art. And on the one hand, like, you know, it's what Audre Lorde said, it's like, poetry is the easiest of the arts, the cheapest of the arts, right? You don't need money to write poetry. Like, you don't need a fancy degree, though maybe it will give you some space to write, to think about it. but it does also mean, it does also turn into like, yeah, the poems can do something else. They can produce some kind of resonance in your body that maybe makes it more possible to both continue caring if you're a carer, or maybe provide some kind of resonance that gives you some support and some hope to go on, you know. And yeah, I'm sure Raymond can talk about that as well in great detail, because I feel like that's how I was receiving the references to Baldwin in Raymond's work. And it's like, oh yeah, this is, you know, in talking in talking about or fictionalizing things that are happening to Baldwin's lovers, and in terms of their suicides, like, it's I mean, it's a lot, but those scenes are incredible in like Another Country and stuff, when the guy jumps off the you know, spoiler for Another Country if anyone's not read Another Country. And it's really intense, it's really difficult to it's so astonishing, and like that really stands up as the moment of like just like an event in literature that also, yeah, I mean, yeah, it's not super articulate, but I hope I'm gonna pass the mic.
No, for sure. No, I resonate with so much of what's said there. You know, the economy of care, and you know, poetry, and you know, putting poetry into our work and putting the work out there carefully is only 50% of the work. Like, it is a very practical thing. Once the work is out there, we have to live our practice. And so I think one of the things that's grounded me is actually having quite specific, I suppose, ideas for where the poems I write may end up. Like, I do imagine them in the classroom. I do imagine them in groups, prison groups. I do imagine them basically in all the spaces which I have already been, or spaces a bit like what Nat was saying about, you know, community, other poets, other readers, friends, family, people we care about, people we care for. And, you know, there's something about the life of a poem, or the life of any of our work, the way it moves through the world, can gift us back, can care for us back. So I'll give you an example of that. You know, I wrote a poem in my first book called Jamaican British, and this poem came out of, I had these students who were being pretty unruly, and wouldn't sit still in the classroom. So they had to be taken out of their mainstream class and put into a smaller classroom where there's only 4 of them. And me and another teacher poet called Christine Foley, we discovered something interesting about these particular boys. You know, that 15-year-old boys who wouldn't sit still unless they saw someone else working. So it was strange. We're like, okay, what we'll do is, before we let them into the classroom, we'll let them see us working. We won't say anything. So we'll sit down and we'll write. And so we would spend the first 10 minutes of each lesson kind of in silence, just writing, letting them see us work, letting them see our heads down, writing a poem. And at the end of every one of those lessons, we would then share what we wrote with the students. And the students would then say to us, oh, wow, because of seeing that, they would give us like 10 minutes of their own quiet focus time, because then they want to compete, then they want to be part of whatever is happening in the room, whatever has kind of been grounded with them seeing us be writers, you know. And so, I wrote Jamaican British in the classroom with these students. And I feel like part of the energy of that has gone into the poem and has moved through the world in a way that it's then ended up on the GCSE curriculum. Like, that poem is now being taught in schools. And so there's something very real for me in that, you know, the energy that we put into the work matters, you know, because it does affect, or can affect, the way in which it is received. You know, I believe in this stuff. I don't think it's some kind of, what's the word, overly kind of romanticizing or ideology. I think it's real.
Nat, were you going to respond to that? You looked as if you were about to say something.
Totally. No.
Yeah.
Totally.
You'd probably be interested to know, Raymond, that a colleague of mine was doing a few of us did some workshops with the NHS hospitals in Manchester, writing workshops, and a colleague of mine used your poem, The First Time I Wore Hearing Aids, as a prompt for a creative writing workshop. So there's an example of the energy of your poem and in a context where the people who care were being given some care in terms of poetry. So like there's an example that's beyond you, that's even beyond your, yeah, so interesting. Okay, so maybe a really practical, I suppose a practical question related to care and craft, maybe, considering that there are going to be some people listening to this who are doing writing workshops. What does it mean to read and write with care, or read and write carefully? What does it mean?
I think for me, I think the thing that comes to mind is this idea of every poem we write, in order to function as a poem, has to have a head and a heart. It can't have just one of those things. And the head and the heart need to be functioning together despite their different, outlooks or functions in the world. And I think we need to apply that, or it often pays off to apply that to our reading as well as our writing. And this is coming from someone who has read poems like the Ted Hughes Deaf School poem, and had such a visceral, painful response to it, because I saw it as a kind of assault, and a assault mainly because a poet had written this such a unconsidered, uncared for poem about deaf people and teachers of the deaf. It was just a kind of all-round failure. I'm going to say that, an all-round failure, which took, I think, which needed a response which wasn't just critical, but was also, also one that which was careful, so in choosing to respond to Ted Hughes after reading his poem, I had to think, okay, well, Ted Hughes is known for these like nature-based extended metaphors, and I can engage with his work because I've read his work carefully. And then I had to imagine, well, I don't think poets, like many of us, get that same kind of care. I don't think we get the same kind of critical care even in our country in which we're writing. But I'm gonna show. I want to show as a poet I'm paying attention, and I'm able. We are able to engage in these questions of craft, and in these questions of not just identity, but just because it's always language. It always comes back to the language. Yeah. I hope that's succinct enough.
I think you just there's something you just said that really chimed with. So I was having a discussion with as part of the library critics with Sarah Howe, and we were talking, and a couple of other writers, and we were talking about like just critical responses and stuff. And I think there's something about why other poets are often the best critics, and best not necessarily in the like objective way, but in like because of that, because like we know what it means to care for other writers' work, because that's what matters to us. That's why poetry matters to us, because there've been moments where a poem resonated or something happened, or took over our lives, gave us some script to live by. And maybe that's why we're good at also like tending other people's poetry, because I think you're totally right. There is sometimes a lack of care in terms of like how poetry's received. And what does it mean to write care with care? I think partly because so much of my writing comes from a space or from experiences that have often fallen out again outside of this economy of care. I'm a survivor of a sort, and like I think a lot about the forms of like denigration that I've experienced and the harm that I've experienced in my life, and like so much of my writing is still kind of like running through that, even if I'm not talking about it directly. It's still like that reparative need is still driving this work, especially in these niners, I think. But in terms of a practice, I'm like, oh, actually, time is really important, because sometimes you do write a poem because it's on an impulse for an occasion that's very soon, something's happening. And so sometimes that can be really careful as an act, and sometimes that can be really brash. But sometimes so that's one form of time, is short time. But sometimes it's just like, oh, the writing just, sometimes there's just poems that need time to develop, and that might be years. That's fine. And that's actually part of like how to really press on what I want this poem to do or to say or to look like or to sound like. Sometimes that doesn't come straight out from the moment of writing. That sometimes that will emerge way later. And like when I was writing the Blubber Gut Southern Leith, for Map, it was like the editor Ray Kamara, the guest editor for that thing, is a super caring, amazing editor, and just like the exemplary in terms of like how to care for this moment publication. And I needed like 2 months, 3 months longer than I originally had. I was only had a month, but that's what the poem needed. And in that period, this poem grew, and like, because it was also like working through all this really heavy, horrific stuff and having to do this research under lockdown. Also, it's like I didn't even get into the full eye of the storm of horror because the archive was closed. But like, yeah, sometimes it's just time. Sometimes it's taking the time. I would say taking the time it needs, and knowing that, trusting yourself when you're like, okay, maybe it's fine. And also sometimes poetry is provisional. That's cool too. That's fine too. But yeah.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. And listening to you, Nat, like there are so many things that you say that sound to me like the start of a new poem. Even the way that you're talking about the care with which you're writing is really so thoughtful and careful and evocative. I guess if we're going to finish now, just to sum up a few things that I've noted down that have been so interesting to think about as I've been listening to you, the idea that care in reading and writing and criticism is to do with a combination of your head and your heart. It's something embodied and emotional and rational. What you said about a poem, Nat, you said about a poem as a script to live by. How could we not care about poetry if that's what we're expecting from it? How could we not care about that? And that beautiful thing that you said about poem as a roof over the heart, I thought that was just really evocative and speaks to what we're thinking about in terms of care and poetry, and how we can care for it and it can care for us. Thanks so much to Bhanu and Raymond and Nat. It's been such a pleasure listening to you this evening. Tonight's event is part of a fantastic lineup of free public events which have taken place every evening this week, exploring care in the Anthropocene, care and waiting, and interspecies care. Tomorrow's event on freedom and care, featuring Maggie Nelson in conversation with Sean Hewitt, is our final event in the series. So please see our website at www.criticalpoetics.co.uk/summer for full details. We'd like to thank our partners, Nottingham Contemporary, curated and created at Nottingham Trent University, and Metronome. Technical support for this event is kindly provided by Nottingham Contemporary. The books related to this event are available via Five Leaves Bookshop, Nottingham's leading independent bookseller. To find out more, please see the details in the event description.